Welcome to Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College. And today, we're very fortunate to have Christina Dando, professor of geography at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. Christina, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy. We're really happy you're able to join us. And as I often begin these interviews or these dialogues, if you will, these conversations, I ask about one's background, really, in terms of what might have inspired you to pursue geography or to consider geography. Can you comment on your childhood and time afterward?
Well, it's literally in my genes, literally. So my dad was William Dando, and he was a geographer. And so I was raised in the whole atmosphere of geography from the get-go. I was born when he was a graduate student at the University of Minnesota. And then we moved to Maryland so he could work on his doctorate. Well, actually, we were in Washington, D.C. He was doing work at Library of Congress. And then eventually he got a job at the University of Maryland, where we lived until I was 10. And then he moved to the University of North Dakota. And so from 10 through college, we lived in North Dakota, except for the year that he taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And so he took us all to Hong Kong with him, of course. And that was just like much of my life, in that we had field trips. So that in Hong Kong, Monday through Friday, we did school, but then on weekends, we would go out and explore Hong Kong. And every time we would try to hit a different part of the territory, part of the city. And so I kind of was raised with always thinking about field trips, being packed in the back of a bus when he would take classes on field trips. My sister, my brother, and I all were taken along on all these, would be dropped in the back of classrooms, dropped in the back of presentations. So always hearing about it, always talking geography. Never thought of that I would do it. But when we were in Hong Kong, my friends were taking a geography class. I was not taking a geography class. I had taken it in high school, and this was my, unfortunately, senior year of high school. Not a great time for me, but a great experience, I would not be the person I am today if I didn't have that experience of being picked up and moved to Hong Kong for a year. Because one of the things was I would help my friends with their homework, their geography homework, over lunch. And I started to see geography differently, because I think my idea of geography, I don't think I really quite understood what my father did. But in Hong Kong, I started to see geography in different eyes. I began to see it as something that I could do because I could help my friends with their homework without even really any effort. And, that was really, I think, a part because I was so well traveled within the U.S. because of the places my father took us to. And also the fact that, let's face it, traveling with my father was a nonstop geography lecture.
Absolutely. Well, your father was a great geographer.
Constantly narrating what was going on and getting us to look and think about things.
Whether you liked it or not, I bet.
Yes, absolutely. But that got me thinking about geography. And so when we got back, I started at the University of North Dakota and majored in geography, but double majored in English. So my thought at the time was to be able to draw maps and write about them, or write and illustrate my own maps, which I think was pretty good. Although I did have another geography student tell me that they thought that was unrealistic, but I think it worked out all right. I think I've done okay with it. When I was in North Dakota, I got an internship at National Geographic my senior year. And so I became one of the National Geographic interns and was the first one to work on the geography education program.
Oh, really? I think, wasn't Bob Dooley running that for a while?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
He was an interesting fellow as well, because I think he came to geography late and he had been a plumber or something like that before.
Yes, exactly. And when I was there, I don't remember exactly the role. Eventually, he ran the intern program for a while, and then he ran the education program. But this was super early. This was when it was a skeleton crew, when they were just setting up the Alliance Network.
Sure.
And
When
it
Kit
was very
Salter was
exciting.
very instrumental in that as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was just like maybe 5 staffers and Kit and Kathy Salter. And as an intern, it was great. I got to do a little bit of everything, from stuffing packets to reviewing National Geographic content for geography and writing up a guide for teachers, helping to work on the institutes. And I actually stayed for another year after the internship.
Is that right?
Yeah.
I think Barry Bishop was around at that time, too.
Yes. Yes. He actually was running the intern program when I arrived. He was a wonderful character. It was really cool.
Certainly.
And in fact, the very first AAG meeting I went to was for the geography education program. I staffed their booth at the first AAG conference they went to as part of the geography education program.
That's wonderful.
It was really great.
So did you take courses from your father at North Dakota?
No. Oh, no. Absolutely refused. Except I went with him on trips to Russia, which were technically courses, but that was the only way I would take a course from my father.
Well, he was a sound Sovietologist as well, and there weren't many in geography at the time that were as conversant in the field as he was.
Well, he really he made it fun, and in fact, I kind of grew up with this weird thing where my whole family was immersed in Russian culture. He eventually talked my mother into getting a degree in Russian language so that she could help him. And he would have students over for Russian dinners before a trip to Russia. So the whole family would get involved with us. And so it's this kind of odd thing because we're not Russian. But we grew up, celebrating Russian Christmas and eating borscht and, all these things.
It's interesting you should say that about your mother and her being encouraged to engage in those studies. Your father related to me that he was he greatly admired your mother, and he realized that she was very important in not only the relationship, in terms of the household, but in terms of his career, as well as, I think, some devotion to making the world a better place. And this was really in an era when there was quite a bit of misogyny, I think. I think misogyny was typical. So he seemed to be somewhat of an aberration in that regard, especially among scholars of his stature.
Theirs is a great love story. And, I think that he always viewed my mom as a partner. And it became even more so once they retired from teaching and began working on the various writing projects that they engaged in. And they published a great deal together as co-authors after they retired from teaching. But something about my parents is that my sister and I are the oldest, and then I have a younger brother. And, for 7 years, my dad had 2 girls. And, this was the 60s and early 70s. And he raised us to do whatever it was that we wanted to do. That if my cousins were going fishing, he'd take us fishing. And then the male cousins would complain and say, "You can't bring girls." And my father would say, "Why not?" And so we were always raised with the idea of why nots. Somebody once asked me, "When did you become a feminist geographer?" I've always been a feminist geographer because I was raised in a house that my dad and mom always said, "Of course you can. Of course women matter. Of course studying women and women's issues matter." We were always encouraged in that way.
Well, it's a very important chapter, I think, in the history of our discipline, because again, your father was not only an aberration, he went against a system in a lot of ways, as characterized by certain social norms that must have grated him, I suppose, and it worked really to not just benefit a happy marriage and a happy family, but also to better the discipline.
Yeah.
You know.
I think so.
So you were at National Geographic, and then you went where?
Well, I actually shifted over and worked for a year with the AAG.
Mm-hmm.
They, at the time, had an opening in the office and needed somebody to fill in working with geographic education. And I knew all the players at that point. And so I worked with GENIP, the Geographic Education National Implementation Project. I worked with Jim Marin on that as the kind of their staff person. And so carried on that work for another year. And during that year, decided to started thinking about graduate school. And that was working with Bob Angenbrug at the AAG. And he was lovely. He was very kind and very supportive. And of course, they encouraged me to go to the absolutely best schools in geography. And so they wanted me to go to Berkeley or Minnesota or Madison. And ultimately, I missed the deadline for Berkeley and didn't find out until they sent the packet of info, because this was, of course, pre-web days.
Sure. Their deadline was always earlier than everybody else.
Yes.
And it was like in November 1 or something like that. You know?
Yes. And of course, they sent the packet in like December, and it clearly said, we won't even open your application if we receive it after the deadline. And it's like, oh, wow, that's really nice to know. So I ended up applying to Madison and to Minnesota and was accepted at both places. But Madison offered money, a teaching assistantship. So I went to Madison. And of course, the great atmosphere of Science Hall was a big seller also. You know, that really great old building of Science Hall is quite a spectacular setting to study geography.
Can you comment on professors that influenced you at Madison?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I ended up working with Tom Vail, which is kind of an unusual choice because most people think of him kind of as more a biogeographer.
Right.
But he had a big interest in the American West, and that really shifted my focus.
And landscape interpretation as well.
Yes, and that really actually is where, between landscape and the American West, is really what caught me. I initially went in thinking I was going to do Soviet geography. There was a guy named Mark Basson that I was going to work with, but he was on sabbatical, and I needed to just take courses, and I ended up taking courses with Tom Vail, and that really sent me in a very different direction. I never imagined I'd end up working on the Great Plains for the rest, well, not quite the rest, pretty much the rest of my career. That never occurred to me. I thought I had to do something farther away, but it was a great class. It was such an engaging, he was such a great instructor that really inspired me. And so I started working on the Great Plains, and I'm still enjoying studying the Great Plains.
Well, that's wonderful. Who else was there that?
Well, when I was there, I ended up, after a year of teaching, of being a TA, I was assigned to physical geography, and I am not a physical geographer. I think I only had one physical geography course, early on, and then to have to teach it, I felt awful. I felt just terrible. I felt like I was a really bad geographer. So I got myself out. I found myself a different job, which was working for the History of Cartography project with David Woodward.
Oh, well, what a blessing that was, I bet.
Oh, it was a game changer for me. I think I was probably on the verge of dropping out, and getting that job and that refuge, because the History of Cartography offices were kind of tucked up in a corner, up high up in the building of Science Hall. Literally, that you walk into the little office suite and you can see the steel graters. Literally, the office space is kind of woven in among the steel grater. And that became a refuge for me. I love the work. I wasn't doing History of Cartography myself, so I always felt a little bit of an imposter. But it was wonderful. I was the illustrations editor for volume 2 book. Oh gosh, I've lost track now. I think it's books 1 and 2 of volume 2. There we go. Volume 2 books 1 and 2 of that massive series. And it was great fun, of learning so much about the history of map making, of writing and exchanging letters at the time with scholars all around the world, writing and obtaining the illustrations from all these different massive
and this is pre-email, really.
Yes,
to a large
yes.
degree. So
just at the end. And in fact, the first email address I had was because David Woodward insisted that we all get email addresses. And in fact, I remember him showing me the very first website I ever saw. He was very forward thinking. He was a true Renaissance man. Because
I don't know if the history of cartography has a more stellar figure, in its past.
He really could do everything from the art to the technology. He was really a lovely person. He and his wife, Roz, were a tremendously supportive atmosphere. As the managing editor, Jude Leimer was also hugely influential. I got to know Matthew Edney during that time. He was not working for the project. He had worked for the project previously. I knew Brian Harley just a little bit. He was there the first couple of years that I was there, but that I worked for the project for 7 years, and that got me through a master's degree and good ways through the PhD. I only left the project when I had to get teaching experience. Because that little bit of teaching physical geography was not going to cut it, especially since I had felt like I had done such a bad job. So I had to, in order to become a lecturer, I had to give up my cushy spot.
Sure.
Which was really hard.
I can imagine, Did you ever take any classes from Yifu Tuan?
I did it. And I'm embarrassed to say it was the worst grade in my graduate career. We did not see, I definitely view him as somebody that was very influential to me, but it was not directly influential. Some scholars, some geographers had very deep relationships with Yifu Tuan. And I really tried. And to be honest, he really tried. He was always willing to try to meet with me, but we just never connected. We just never found a easy conversation. Everything was a struggle. And so I just had to kind of let that go.
Well, I asked because you used a lot of his work in the past.
I do. Yes, absolutely. He absolutely is an influence to me. But again, I'm not one of his group. And that's okay. That's all right. Sometimes the inspiration that we take from people or the grounding we get from people is not from directly, but sometimes it's indirectly. So
certainly. Absolutely. No question. So what about colleagues? What about fellow graduate students?
Well, yes, lots. Tim Cresswell was there right when I started. We were not super tight, but we were in some classes together. Steve Silvern we were colleagues in some of the courses we took. There are some other geographers that I stay in touch with all the time. Eric Olmanson, Bill Gardner, Paul Adams, who does work on media geography and is at the University of Texas, Austin.
Right.
He and I were roommates together the second year of grad school, along with a third geographer who I married for a while, now divorced. But Paul and Ty and I were all roommates the second year of grad school. And Paul and I are still friends, still stay in touch.
Well, good. So after Madison, you have your PhD, and then where'd you go?
Here to Omaha. So I was very lucky to get a chance at a visiting assistant professor position that I interviewed for I think it was 3 days before I walked at graduation. And I remember, I think Tom was a little upset. Tom Vale was a little upset with me because I actually walked at graduation 2 weeks before my defense date.
Mm-hmm.
But if I didn't walk then, I was going to have to wait until December. And I thought that I would much rather go through the hoop and assume that I'm going to make it through. And I did, but I think he was a little irritated with me for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very nice at graduation to be able to tell Tom that I had gotten the position. So I came to Omaha and was 2 years in a visiting position, and then had a chance at tenure track and got the tenure track position. And it's been a really good place for me. I mean, to be able to be in a location where I can teach the geography of the Great Plains pretty much anytime I want is pretty sweet. You know, it's a unusual topic. You can't teach geography of the Great Plains a lot of locations. So it's works out very well that way. And I'm affiliated with the Center for Great Plains Studies in Lincoln, which is if you're not aware of it, it is a wonderful, probably, at least in terms of the Great Plains, the major focus of Great Plains research on the plains. I mean, there are smaller centers that are regional study centers, but the Center for Great Plains Studies is pretty awesome. They have 2 journals, Great Plains Quarterly, Great Plains Research. So I'm affiliated with them. I've presented at their symposiums, which are basically their conferences. I have published in their journals. I've been very active with the Center for Great Plains Studies, which is great. Keeps me well connected to my region and to my fellow scholars of the plains.
Well, sure. And Omaha is a lovely city. You have a graduate program in your department. And it's really been a pretty vibrant graduate program for, my goodness, probably 4 or 5 decades now.
Been a while, yes.
You know, it's been a while. I guess, in a way, as I think about it, it still shows considerable promise to even grow larger as far as the geography influence goes. And this is at a time when the department at Lincoln has met with some difficulties. You know?
We continue to chug along, and I think part of what really helps our department is that we are a metropolitan campus, and the city of Omaha is a lot larger than people usually envision it. The metro area is probably close to 1 million if you take in Council Bluffs and all the various suburbs, and you have the Offutt Air Force Base just to our south, and so there is a sizable population of people, who are interested. Now, of course, we always want more. We could always use more graduate students, and we're always working on that. But we do all right. We've been holding on fairly steady, and hopefully we'll keep that.
Are your graduate students largely coming from Nebraska?
Yes, quite a few. Although at the moment we're getting quite a few international students. So we'll see how this continues to develop. But I would say over the past 10, 15 years, most of them have been coming from Nebraska. Quite a few actually began as undergraduates in our program and then decided to continue on. But we also have a nice little chunk that come from former military who may have been stationed here at Offutt and then decide to retire back to Omaha and then turn to us to pick up their master's degrees. And so that's always a good one.
Well, you teach graduate courses as well as undergraduate courses. Do you have different kinds of advice you give to undergraduates and graduate students?
Well, of course, but I think the one thing that I probably advise everybody is that if you're going to add one tool to your toolbox, make it GIS. And that's coming from somebody who doesn't do GIS. I don't do GIS. That never quite made sense for the type of research and work I do. But at the same time, I'm definitely very much aware of how much that skill set is valued to employers. You know, we probably, one of our biggest problems our graduate program has is that our graduate students get hired out before they're done. They get those GIS skills and then they get an internship, and then they lose focus on the master's because they've gotten a better job, which is on one hand a wonderful problem, and on the other hand makes our numbers look not as good as it could be. So
Sure. So do you have students that are interested in conducting the kind of research that you engaged in when you were at Madison?
not really.
You know?
Which sounds really kind of funny because, well, my background in from Madison is, I would say, landscape.
Sure.
And I kind of am on the border between human geography and human environment geography.
Absolutely.
You know, because honestly, with a region like the Great Plains, you have to pay attention to the environment. You cannot study the plains without being deeply grounded, literally, in this landscape. So we have some, but not as much as I would like, you know. But also, for that matter, as much as I have an interest in gender, and I have had hardly any students work on gender. But instead, I think this is partially my own personal philosophy, is I work with the graduate students with whatever they want to work on. You know, there are some PhD geographers who work with graduate students who want to have students who work in the area that they work in only. So I've heard of geographers who are in a really narrow niche, like economic geography, and they only want to work with students who are also interested in their narrow version of economic geography. I'll work with any student who needs me. And so, you know, that
I think that's a good attitude to have because, I mean, we're an eclectic field. If we don't know something specifically, we can figure it out.
I guess I also think that part of the master's program is for students to become the master. So they need to become the expert in their area that they're working in. I don't need to be the expert. I need to learn from them, and I always do.
Certainly. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your research, if you don't mind. You've really made a commitment, it seems, to ameliorate social injustice. You know, you've discussed the importance of land acknowledgement, and you've carried out some research that is really pretty interesting with regard to, let's say, disenfranchised populations. Would you care to comment on some of that?
Yeah, this is actually a relatively new area for me, and in fact, one I haven't yet published in. We're still working on that. So, stepping back for a second, my dissertation was on the Great Plains and was looking at how people literally envisioned the plains by looking at photograph albums. So it's basically historical work on the Great Plains, landscape, very much landscape work. And this kind of, I view my research as kind of occupying a couple different realms that they kind of overlap. Media might be photography or film, maps, landscape, in particular the Great Plains. I'm also interested in gender. And so when I finished my PhD, you know, I tried to get some publications out of my dissertation, which I did. And then, you know, you start to explore other things that interest you. And so I've played in a variety of realms. I've worked on women in mapping in the early 20th century. But we had an opportunity, and I say we because I ended up collaborating with two colleagues here on campus. Jeanette Gabriel, who's a professor in the Schwab Center for Israel and Jewish Studies, and Jennifer Harbour, who's a professor of Black Studies. And the university, in the wake of the George Floyd murder in the Twin Cities and the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, decided it wanted to make a strategic investment in issues of social justice, inequality, race, class, and ethnicity. And so they basically called for proposals And so we put forward a proposal that was really inspired by the University of Minnesota's Mapping Inequality Project, which is an amazing project that's been going on for, at least 10 or 15 years, that's mapping racially restrictive covenants in the Twin Cities. And so we put together a proposal to do a similar thing for Omaha, and we were astonished when we got the grant. And so we've been working over the past 2.5 years at locating and gathering these racially restrictive covenants and mapping them out. And that is working with my colleague, Paul Hunt, who is our GIS guru. In the meantime, all three, Jeanette and Jennifer and I, are all historians. And so while we've been identifying these racially restrictive covenants, we've also been studying the history of Omaha to be able to put them in context. We have to understand what was Omaha like when these started to be implemented. And the thing that is fascinating is that as these various projects, because there's many of these projects looking at racially restricted covenants around the country. I mean, there's work being done in Seattle at the University of Washington. They've got a wonderful project. There's work being done in Milwaukee. There's work being done in Chicago. I mean, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles. I mean, this literally is going on all around the country. And as we start to learn more about these different settings, we're finding that how these roll out varies by the location. Big surprise to a geographer, right? Location matters. We're still figuring this out. But in the case of Omaha, for example, most of the racially restrictive covenants are coming out in about the 1940s. In particular, 1947 was a very big year. And a lot of these covenants are real estate agreements. And these kind of covenants, people use covenants all the time to say, we're going to agree that you have to not paint your house, bright purple. We're going to say that you have to have a certain type of fence or not have a certain type of fence. We're going to say you can't have a business in your home. But these particular covenants are saying that you can't sell to anybody but a Caucasian, which meant that it was preventing certain people from buying in particular neighborhoods. And we see this as kind of the flip side to redlining. Redlining being the practice of granting home ownership loans. HOLC, Homeowners Loan Corporation, in the 1930s,
right.
Was giving out grants to help people stay in their homes. It was mortgage assistance. But they favored some neighborhoods, while other neighborhoods they viewed as high risk.
Right.
And those high risk neighborhoods were colored red, which is where the term redlining comes from. So that was about who could get a home ownership loan. Although, little caveat, people did get loans in those neighborhoods. In the redline neighborhoods, there were HOLC loans granted. It's just a much smaller number. And we're actually currently working on investigating those here in Omaha. So you've got who could get a loan, but racially restricted covenants are instead about where you could then buy a house. So it's like the other end of it. For us, in approaching this project, the redlining maps that everybody thinks about are a bit of everybody focuses on the maps because there is that misperception that they were used, like as in somebody had them up on the wall and said, "Where do you live? Oh, you live there? No, we can't give you one." No, they created the maps afterwards, after the loans were made. So it really reflects the mindset of the banks and the real estate industry, because they were the one really guiding, perceptions of neighborhoods.
Sure. So it was the mental map of the banking industry, essentially, that created the cartographic product that was then relied upon later, that could be matched today with this influence of segregation historically that has affected so much, especially public education. One of my students, Sandra Johnson, has been working on that for the city of Grand Rapids. It's very interesting.
Yes. So what we are doing is the big project that we're undertaking is mapping out these racially restricted covenants to create a GIS database that we're going to make eventually publicly available. Publicly available to UNO scholars, to UNO students, but also to the broader Omaha community at no charge. So to create this community resource that could then be combined with education data or public health data or environmental data. For example, we know that Omaha is a Superfund site because of a lead smelter that used to be down by the river. You know, basically the eastern portion of the city from about 55th Street eastward is Superfund site. So, you know, if we can combine these racially restrictive covenants with other information, how can we get a better understanding of our city? We also need to think about how cities change over time so that the city that existed at the time that the redlining maps were created is not the same as it exists today. You know, the populations change. You know, if you look at the redlining map of Omaha, there were 3 areas redlined. The North Omaha, which is predominantly Black. There's a little tiny area in the middle that is actually the Polish neighborhood. And then South Omaha down by the packing houses. And, you know, in the 1930s, South Omaha was incredibly diverse. You had immigrants from all over Europe, as well as other parts of the world. You had all over Eastern Europe, you had Italians, you had Bohemians. There was the Greeks, unfortunately, had already been driven out by then because there was a major racial incident involving the Greeks in the teens. But
Thankfully, they allowed the Italians to stay, you know?
Yes, well, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. But South Omaha was very diverse. If you look at Omaha today and look at South Omaha is predominantly Hispanic. It is a very different landscape than was 1930s. And so we have to be very careful about taking old maps and matching it with today's landscape.
Did that Hispanic community really emerge in the 50s, or was it much later?
I think it started to rise out of the 50s. Definitely, there were people of Hispanic ancestry in Omaha, 1890s, 1900, 1910, small numbers. And then as you know, the classic kind of shifts that happen with immigration as second, third generation, you know, whether they're Italian or Polish, you know, their children get education, they want a bigger house, they move out of the neighborhood, new immigrants move in, you know, the classic, was it invasion and secession? You know, you have this ongoing shift that happens. And of course, as more and more people from Central and South America have come into the United States, they've moved to South Omaha where it's affordable housing, you know, where there are job opportunities, where there's community support.
It's fascinating, and Omaha is a fascinating city. In a way, it seems like you've shifted from the historical geography of the rural Great Plains to the historical geography of this urban entrepot of sorts.
Exactly. So it is a very new realm for me, but we are really enjoying it, and we are finding so much material to work with. So many fascinating stories.
That's wonderful. Well, Christina, we have about a minute to go here, and I have to ask you if you reflect upon your career, where you've been, if you think about the students that you have had and the colleagues that you have. You know, you've commented that you recommend students take GIS courses, but are there any pearls of wisdom you'd like to share to students interested in pursuing geography, or even colleagues practicing today?
I think that we have to be passionate about what we do, and that we need to follow our passions, you know? But I also say that the great thing about geography is that almost anything can find a home in geography, so that whether you're interested in Frisbee golf or whether you're interested in your ancestry, it can all find a home in geography. And, yes, we need tools like GIS, but also we can also really have our passionate things, because we need to be able to feed our souls. And that really, for me, geography and landscape and seeing places and reading about places and studying places really feeds my passion. And it's really exciting to see students become engaged, to find that passion and pursue that passion. And that's what I try to do here.
Interpreting ordinary landscapes is fascinating. And as you say, it feeds the soul. Christina, thank you so much for spending this time with us.
It's been a pleasure.
And this concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.